Part 1. The Anatomy of a Curse. Let's begin on the left side of the infographic. Notice that a curse doesn't begin with magic. It begins with an event. Something painful happens. You lose your job. Your relationship ends. You become ill. Someone tells you they've cursed you. Pain creates uncertainty. And the human mind dislikes uncertainty. So naturally, it begins looking for meaning. This is step 2. The mind starts connecting dots. Maybe it wasn't bad luck. Maybe someone wished me harm. Maybe that strange dream meant something. Maybe I have the evil eye. Humans are extraordinary meaning-making creatures. Our survival has always depended on recognizing patterns. The problem is, sometimes we recognize patterns that aren't actually there. Next comes belief formation. The interpretation gradually becomes an identity. Instead of saying, "Something unfortunate happened," we begin saying, "I'm cursed." Notice how subtle that shift is. The story becomes personal. And once the story feels personal, our emotions follow. Fear, anxiety, shame, hopelessness. The stronger the emotions become, the more convincing the story appears. Now we enter confirmation bias. Without realizing it, we begin collecting evidence. Every coincidence supports the belief. Every setback confirms the curse. Everything that doesn't fit the story is quietly ignored. Psychology has studied this tendency for decades. Our minds naturally notice evidence that supports our existing beliefs, not because we're irrational, but because that's how human cognition works. Eventually, the belief changes behavior. We avoid opportunities. We isolate ourselves. We spend enormous amounts of money trying to remove invisible threats. Relationships suffer. Hope diminishes. Ironically, the original belief begins creating real suffering. Whether or not the curse was ever real, the suffering certainly is. Part 2. The Buddhist Antidote. Now let's move to the center. Buddhism begins somewhere very different. The Buddha did not ask, "Who cursed you?" He asked, "What is happening?" This changes everything. Instead of immediately accepting our interpretation, we investigate our experience. The first antidote is right view. Right view doesn't mean believing the correct religion. It means seeing causes and conditions clearly. Not every painful experience needs a supernatural explanation. Sometimes events arise because of countless interconnected causes. Nothing exists independently. The next principle is impermanence. Thoughts change, feelings change, circumstances change, fear changes. If something is constantly changing, can it truly define who you are? Then comes one of Buddhism's most radical teachings, non-self. If someone says, "You are cursed," Buddhism gently asks, "Who is this permanent you?" This doesn't deny your experience. It simply questions whether there is a fixed identity underneath it. The label begins losing its grip. Dependent origination teaches that nothing appears by itself. Fear depends on thoughts. Thoughts depend on interpretations. Interpretations depend on memory. Memory depends on conditioning. Once we understand the conditions, we can begin changing them. Mindfulness becomes our laboratory. Instead of believing every thought, we simply observe. I notice fear. I notice catastrophic thinking. I notice my mind creating a story. That small shift creates enormous freedom. Finally, wisdom. Wisdom isn't collecting more beliefs. Wisdom is seeing reality more clearly, and clarity naturally dissolves unnecessary fear. Part 3. What depth psychology adds. Carl Jung observed something fascinating. What remains unconscious often appears to come from outside ourselves. He famously wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Sometimes, what feels like an external curse may actually be an inherited pattern: family trauma, childhood shame, negative self-beliefs, old emotional wounds. They continue influencing our lives until we become aware of them. Projection is another important insight. Sometimes the fear we experience internally becomes projected outward. Instead of recognizing our anxiety, we imagine an outside force attacking us. Again, this doesn't make the suffering fake. It simply changes where we look for healing. Jung also described individuation, the lifelong process of becoming conscious, not becoming someone new, but discovering who we've always been beneath our conditioning. Part 4. The True Curse. We all inherit. Now we arrive at what I believe is the heart of this entire presentation. If there truly is a universal curse, I don't believe it is something another person casts upon us. It is something every human being inherits. We inherit conditioning, family stories, cultural beliefs, trauma, habits, fear, and perhaps most importantly, our tendency to mistake those inherited stories for reality itself. Buddhism calls this ignorance, not stupidity, not lack of intelligence, simply not seeing clearly. We mistake temporary thoughts for permanent truth. We mistake fear for certainty. We mistake stories for reality. That may be the closest thing Buddhism has to a curse. Breaking the spell. Fortunately, anything conditioned can be transformed. That is one of Buddhism's most hopeful teachings. The spell breaks when we pause, notice our experience, question our interpretations, meet fear with compassion rather than panic, and gradually cultivate wisdom. Not because wisdom destroys curses, but because wisdom changes the way we relate to experience. Conclusion. Whether you believe in curses or not, all of us know what it's like to become trapped inside a story. A story that says, I'm broken, I'm doomed, I'm unlucky, I'll never change. Perhaps the greatest protection isn't another ritual, another talisman, or another cleansing. Perhaps the greatest protection is learning to see clearly. Because when we see clearly, fear loses its authority. And what once felt like an unbreakable curse becomes another conditioned pattern that can be understood and transformed. Thank you for watching. If this perspective resonated with you, consider subscribing for more explorations of practical Buddhism, depth psychology, and timeless wisdom for modern life. Until next time, see clearly, be free.